There is a specific kind of cold that settles over Duluth, Minnesota, around the middle of January. It is not the sort of cold that merely nips at your skin. It is a heavy, quiet frost that rolls off Lake Superior and wedges itself into the woodwork of your house, making the floorboards groan under your feet. For 68 years I have watched that frost form on the edges of my kitchen window, and for 40 of those years I made a living by anticipating exactly what kind of damage that weather could do. As an underwriting manager for a major commercial insurance firm, my entire life was dictated by risk. I spent my days looking at columns of figures, reading the fine print that everyone else skipped, and calculating the exact cost of human error, negligence, and greed. People often think that risk assessment is a fast-paced game of intuition, but it is not. It is slow. It is tedious. It requires you to sit perfectly still and look at a problem until it reveals its weakest point. Cleverness is fast, you see. What I do is slow. Every morning, I follow the exact same routine. I stand in my kitchen, looking out at the gray expanse of the lake, and I prepare a cup of espresso. I do not use one of those modern plastic machines with buttons and flashing lights that promises coffee in 30 seconds. I use a 1998 La Pavoni Europiccola. It is made of solid brass and copper, heavy enough to break your toes if you dropped it, and it operates entirely by a manual lever. It requires you to feel the pressure of the water against the coffee grounds. If you pull too fast, you ruin the shot. If you are too slow, it burns. It demands patience and absolute control. While the boiler heats up, I find myself tapping my right index finger twice against my thumb. It is an old habit, a nervous quirk I picked up decades ago in the corporate offices whenever a file landed on my desk that did not smell quite right. It is a physical manifestation of my mind telling me to pause, look closer, and double-check the math. I am telling you this story because someone recently asked me if I regretted the silence I kept during the most difficult year of my life. They wondered how a father could sit at a Sunday dinner table, look into the eyes of the man who was systematically robbing his family, and not say a single word. They wanted to know if I was paralyzed by fear, or perhaps just too old to fight back. I had to smile at that, a small, quiet smile that never quite reached my eyes. I will not be taking questions about whether I am too old to protect what belongs to my daughter, but I will tell you how it happened. From the very first red flag to the final invoice delivered by the federal government, before we go any further into the numbers and the cold reality of what occurred, I want to welcome you to the channel. If you have made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. The story really begins with Clara. Clara is my only child, named after her mother who passed away 12 years ago from a sudden illness that left our home feeling far too large and far too quiet. Clara inherited her mother's eyes, and unfortunately, for her mother's absolute refusal to see the malice in other people. She became a high school art teacher, a woman who looks at a broken piece of pottery and sees a mosaic waiting to be built. When her mother died, she left behind a modest inheritance, which I immediately placed into an irrevocable trust fund, along with a significant portion of my own life savings. The total amount was exactly $1,245,000. I did not establish this fund so Clara could live a life of reckless luxury. I established it because I wanted to ensure that long after my own hands grew too stiff to turn the lever on my espresso machine, my daughter and my 7-year-old grandson, Leo, would have a roof over their heads and a shield against the unexpected storms of life. Then came Julian. Julian entered Clara's life 5 years ago like an executive assembled from a glossy corporate catalog. He was 32 at the time, working as a junior partner in a mid-sized architectural consultancy in Minneapolis. He wore shoes that were always slightly too polished for a Duluth winter, and he spoke with a rapid, breathless enthusiasm about market trends, venture capital, and leveraging assets. The first time Clara brought him to the house for dinner, the silence sat like a fifth guest at the table. I watched him closely as he explained his 5-year plan for his career. I noticed the way his eyes darted around my living room, lingering on the original oil paintings Clara's mother had collected, evaluating the molding on the ceiling, estimating the square footage. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. During that first dinner, something in my stomach shifted. It was that familiar, low-level alarm that used to hit me when an insurance applicant claimed their warehouse had never suffered water damage despite being built on a floodplain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply asked him a few basic questions about his firm's debt-to-equity ratio and how they handled overhead during the winter slowdown. Julian chuckled, a sharp, patronizing sound that grated against the quiet of my kitchen. He leaned forward, adjusting his silver watch, and said, "Ilias, the world moves a lot faster now than it did when you were looking at spreadsheets. Financial risk isn't something you avoid anymore. It's something you manipulate." I didn't argue with him. I just sat there, tapped my index finger twice against my thumb, and let the conversation drift back to Clara's upcoming school exhibition. They were married 14 months later in a small ceremony near the shore. I paid for the wedding, down to the last dollar, and as a wedding gift, I purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman home for them in Fountain City, just a short distance from where I lived. The deed was placed under the name of the trust, a detail Julian seemed to view as a mere bureaucratic technicality, rather than the legal fortress it actually was. He assumed, as many young men of his particular disposition do, that an old man living alone with an antique coffee maker was a man who had forgotten how to read a legal contract. He treated me with a sort of polite condescension, the kind of kindness people reserve for old dogs that can no longer fetch the morning paper. For the first few years, things appeared stable on the surface. Fine is a word that sounds like a compliment but isn't. They seemed fine. But a trained underwriter doesn't look at the clear blue sky to predict a storm. He looks at the barometer. I began to notice small deviations in the pattern. It started with Julian's car, a brand new leased European SUV that cost more per month than Clara's entire monthly grocery budget. Then came the expensive weekend trips to Chicago, the tailored suits, and the sudden, unprompted announcements from Julian about his impending promotion to senior partner, a promotion that somehow always seemed to be pushed back by another 6 months, due to internal politics. It was during our traditional Tuesday night dinners at my house that the cracks began to show through the drywall. Julian would arrive late, his jaw doing that slow rhythmic grinding thing that people do when their blood pressure is rising and they are trying desperately to hide it. He would stare at his phone throughout the meal, barely touching the pot roast I had spent 4 hours preparing. Clara would watch him with a quiet, anxious sadness in her eyes, her hand frozen on the wooden edge of the dining table whenever he snapped at a harmless question from little Leo. I knew I needed an objective perspective, someone who could look at the ledger without the emotional fog of being a father. That was when I called Marcus. Marcus has been my closest friend since we were roommates at the University of Minnesota in 1978. He is a senior tax attorney, with a reputation for being as unyielding as a granite headstone, and twice as cynical. Marcus doesn't do small talk, and he doesn't drink commercial coffee. He came over on a Thursday evening, his heavy leather briefcase bulging with tax codes, and sat at my kitchen counter while I prepared him a double shot of espresso from the Le Pavoni. Marcus took a sip, winced slightly at the heat, and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "You didn't invite me here to discuss the weather, Elias," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that had intimidated hundreds of IRS auditors over the years. "What's the exposure?" "I think my son-in-law is drowning," I told him plainly. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't say I hated him, or that he was ruining my daughter's life, though both statements would have been true. He's living a $500,000 life on a $90,000 salary. And last week, Clara mentioned that Julian offered to take over the administrative paperwork for her mother's trust fund to save me the trouble of dealing with the bank. Marcus set his cup down with a sharp click against the granite counter. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the steady, low hiss of the steam valve on the espresso machine. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small notepad and pointed his pen at me. Tell me you didn't give him the password to the trustee portal, Elias. I looked out the window at the snow falling over the dark waters of Lake Superior. I tapped my index finger twice against my thumb. I didn't give him anything, Marcus, but he knows where the physical ledger is kept, and he knows the name of the regional bank manager who handles the account. He thinks I'm an old man who forgets where he puts his reading glasses. Marcus leaned back, a cold, calculating look entering his eyes. Greed makes people stupid, Elias, but desperate greed makes them dangerous. If he touches that money without your explicit authorization as the primary trustee, it's federal fraud. But if he manages to trick Clara into signing a power of attorney amendment, he can siphon that fund dry before you even get your monthly statement. I know, I replied quietly. That's why I need you to look into his firm's public filings. I want to know exactly how much water his boat is taking on before he tries to use my daughter's future as a life jacket. Marcus nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and packed his notepad away. Consider it done. I'll have the preliminary audit on your desk by Monday morning. But do me a favor, old friend. Until I give you the numbers, don't say a word to him. Not a single word. I went very, very quiet a long time ago. Marcus, I said as I wiped down the chrome base of the espresso machine. And trust me, when I finally speak, he's going to wish he had never learned how to read a balance sheet. The weekend after my conversation with Marcus was agonizingly slow. I spent Saturday morning in the garage, cleaning the carburetor of my 1984 Ford F-150. It is a machine that makes sense to me. Gas, air, spark. If one is missing, it simply does not run. Human beings are rarely that simple. I wiped the grease from my hands with an old rag, listening to the heavy silence of the neighborhood. The snow was piled 3 feet high against the driveway markers. I was waiting for Monday. I was waiting for the numbers. When you spend your life as an underwriter, you learn that people will lie to you with a perfectly straight face, but a bank ledger never does. A ledger is the closest thing to a confession you will ever get in the corporate world. Think about that for a second. Sunday dinner arrived right on schedule. Clara came through the front door carrying a grocery bag, her shoulders tight beneath her heavy wool coat. Julian followed 10 steps behind her, glued to his phone screen, his thumb swiping aggressively. He didn't even take off his leather gloves before walking into my kitchen. That was the first red flag of the evening. He was physically present, but his mind was running on a treadmill of panic. We sat down at the dining table, the 3 of us, and little Leo, who was busy arranging his plastic dinosaurs near the salt shaker. I served the roast chicken. Nobody said anything for a while. The silence had weight to it. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a very loud noise. Market's a bit volatile this week, Elias, Julian said suddenly, stabbing a piece of carrot with his fork. He didn't look at me. A lot of old money portfolios are taking a beating. You really should let me take a look at the trust's asset allocation, just to make sure you aren't bleeding out to inflation. I took a slow sip of my water. The trust is invested in municipal bonds and a few blue-chip index funds, I replied calmly. It's not designed to be fast, Julian. It's designed to be heavy. It doesn't move when the wind blows. Julian let out a short, tight breath through his nose. Bonds are dead capital. You're losing purchasing power every single day. Look, Clara and I were talking, and with the new tax laws coming into effect, it makes sense to update the trustee permissions, just for administrative efficiency. I looked at Clara. Her eyes dropped to her plate. Her hand was still frozen on the table, clutching her napkin. She hadn't been talking to him about tax laws. He was using her as a shield. I went very, very quiet. Monday morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., Marcus walked into my kitchen without knocking. He dropped a manila folder on the counter next to the La Pavoni. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "You owe me a very good steak for this," Marcus said, not bothering to take off his coat. I poured him his espresso. "How bad is the weather over there?" I asked. Marcus opened the folder. "It's a Category 5 hurricane, Elias. Your son-in-law is a walking insolvency." I looked at the top sheet. The numbers were stark. Julian's architectural firm wasn't just struggling. It was hemorrhaging cash. But the real disaster wasn't corporate, it was personal. Julian had opened 2 margin accounts under his own name, betting heavily on speculative tech options. He was $85,412 in the red. The margin calls were already hitting his inbox. "He's desperate," Marcus said quietly, tracing a line on the spreadsheet with his pen. "He needs liquid cash to cover the margin calls before the brokerage liquidates his actual assets, and his partners find out he's functionally bankrupt. He can't get a bank loan. His credit is practically non-existent at this point." I stared at the figure. 85 grand. It was enough to ruin a young man's career, but not enough to justify stealing $1 million from his own wife and child. Unless, of course, he planned to take much more to cover his tracks and reinvest the rest to win it all back. The gambler's fallacy. "He mentioned the trust yesterday," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He wants to update the trustee permissions." Marcus stopped writing. He looked up, his expression hardening. "If he gets his name on that account, Elias, the money is gone. You need to lock it down right now. Move the funds. Change the regional manager." I tapped my index finger twice against my thumb. "No," I said. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me." I turned toward the window, watching the snow blow sideways across the lake. "If I block him now, he'll just find another way. He'll take out a second mortgage on Claire's house. He'll forge her signature on a personal loan. If he is drowning, he will pull her under with him. I mean that literally." I turned back to Marcus. "I don't just need to stop him. I need him to fall into a hole so deep that he can never ever climb out and drag my daughter down again." Marcus narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "What are you thinking, Elias?" I walked over to my desk and pulled out the original binder containing the trust documents. "I'm thinking about the structure of a distribution trap," I said, opening the binder to Section 4, subsection B. "Here is the thing about irrevocable trust funds that young men in tailored suits fail to understand. They are not standard bank accounts. They are legal entities. They have rules, federal tax IDs, and very specific clauses regarding how money can be dispersed." Julian thought he just needed a routing number and a password. He thought it was simply a matter of transferring digits from one screen to another. Later that week, Julian stopped by my house unannounced. It was a Thursday afternoon. He brought a stack of papers and a very strained smile. "Elias, I know you're busy," he said, standing in my hallway, refusing to take off his coat. "But my firm's legal team reviewed the trust framework. There's a vulnerability in the primary beneficiary clause. If something happens to you, the probate court could freeze the assets for months. Clara asked me to bring this over. It just adds me as a secondary administrative trustee, purely a backup measure." It was a beautifully constructed lie. I took the papers from him. My hands did not shake. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw him out into the cold. I looked at the signature line. He had already managed to get Clara to sign it, likely by telling her it was routine paperwork for their own taxes. Her signature was right there in blue ink. He was using her absolute trust against her. Something in my chest did a thing it had never done before. It wasn't anger. It was an absolute cold clarity. "I'll review this, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And I'll file it with the bank tomorrow." His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Relief washed over his face, so obvious and pathetic that I almost smiled. Almost. Which, if you know me, is the closest thing to a miracle. He thanked me, shook my hand, and walked out the door. He didn't know it yet, but he had just handed me the rope. The next morning, I drove down to the regional bank branch. I sat down with the manager, a woman named Sarah, who had known my late wife. I didn't file the paper Julian gave me. I filed a modified version, one that I had prepared with Marcus, late into the night. It granted Julian exactly what he wanted, the ability to initiate transfers out of the trust. But it came with a highly specific invisible string attached regarding federal tax liabilities. At 2:11 a.m. the following Tuesday, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was an automated alert from the bank. A transfer had been initiated. $450,000 was moving from the trust into a newly formed LLC. I sat up in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, staring at the glowing screen. I had let him open the door. $450,000. Most people would experience a profound, paralyzing panic, seeing that number vanish from a screen in the dead of night. I did not panic. Panic is what happens when a variable enters the equation that you did not account for. I had accounted for this. I got out of bed, my knees popping softly in the dark, and walked down to the kitchen. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I simply stood by the window, letting the bitter cold radiating through the glass seep into my skin. The waiting was over. The trap had been triggered. By 8:30 the next morning, I was sitting in Marcus's downtown office. The room smelled of aged leather and the sharp tang of printer toner. Marcus was typing furiously on his keyboard, his reading glasses pushed down to the tip of his nose. He hit the enter key with a definitive thwack and spun his monitor around so I could see it. Apex Strategic Ventures, LLC. Marcus read aloud, his voice dripping with professional disdain. Registered in Delaware exactly 3 weeks ago. The registered agent is a shell service, but the routing number for the receiving bank account traces back to a private wealth management branch right here in Minneapolis. Your son-in-law is moving fast. He has to, I said, studying the screen. Margin calls don't wait for the snow to melt. How much did he funnel to his brokerage account? Marcus pulled up another window. Of the $450,000, he instantly wired $85,412 to cover his immediate debts. He stopped the bleeding. But here is the interesting part, Elias. He didn't just cover his losses. He took another $200,000, bought heavily into a leveraged tech ETF. He thinks he's buying the dip. He thinks he's going to double the trust money, replace the principal before anyone notices, and pocket the profit. And the rest of the money? I asked quietly. Sitting in the LLC's checking account, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. Probably meant for lifestyle maintenance. Or maybe he's shopping for a boat. The arrogance is almost impressive. He thinks because the money is in an LLC, it's insulated from the trust's oversight. I looked at the printed ledger on Marcus's desk. He missed the classification. Marcus offered a grim, razor-thin smile. He missed it entirely. Because of the specific amendment you filed with the bank, Julian's withdrawal was not classified as a standard administrative transfer. It was legally categorized as an early non-exempt distribution directly to him as a taxable individual. By routing it into a single-member LLC, tied to his own Social Security number, he essentially claimed it as personal income, short-term capital gains and unearned income. Think about that for a second. Julian thought he was operating in the shadows, moving invisible money through corporate shields, but in the eyes of the federal government, he had just walked into a brightly lit room, held up a sign with his name on it, and declared $500,000 of immediate heavily taxed income. And because he didn't set aside a single dime for estimated taxes, the IRS was going to descend on him like a hawk on a field mouse. But not yet. The beauty of the tax code is its patience. The IRS doesn't strike in November. They strike in April. That Sunday, Julian and Clara came over for dinner. The shift in Julian's demeanor was so abrupt, it was almost comical. The panicked, teeth-grinding desperation from the previous week was completely gone. He walked into my house, looking like a man who had just conquered a small country. He was wearing a new watch. It was a bulky, rose-gold chronograph that easily cost $15,000. He kept pulling his cuff back to ensure I could see it. "Smells great, Elias," Julian said loudly, walking straight into the kitchen and opening my refrigerator without asking. He pulled out a bottle of imported sparkling water he had brought the week before. "You know, I was looking at some real estate listings in Naples, Florida. The market down there is incredibly soft right now. Prime time to pick up a winter property." Clara was standing by the doorway, holding little Leo's hand. She looked exhausted, her eyes were shadowed, and her posture was defensive. "Julian, we haven't even finished paying for the roof repairs on our house," she said, her voice tight. Julian waved a hand dismissively, the rose-gold watch catching the kitchen light. "Don't worry about the small stuff, Clara. I've got a few major deals closing. The liquidity is there. We need to start thinking bigger." Right, Elias? He looked at me, a smug, challenging glint in his eye. He was practically daring me to question him. He felt untouchable. He had outsmarted the old underwriter. I was standing by the counter, wiping down the brass boiler of my La Pavoni espresso machine. I didn't look at his watch. I didn't look at his smug face. I looked at Clara. I saw the quiet terror of a woman who knows her husband is lying but doesn't have the proof to confront him. Something in my stomach shifted, heavy and cold. I placed the cleaning rag down on the granite counter. I held up one hand, just one. The kitchen went entirely silent. Julian stopped unscrewing the cap of his water bottle. Naples is nice, I said evenly, but the property taxes are aggressive. Make sure you're properly accounting for your tax liabilities, Julian. Surprises in the first quarter can be devastating. Julian smirked, taking a long drink of water. I have a guy who handles my taxes, Elias, top-tier firm in Chicago. I don't worry about the IRS. They only go after people who don't know how to structure their wealth. Is that so? I murmured. I turned back to the espresso machine. I went very, very quiet. I let the silence stretch out, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough that Julian shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Beautiful the way certain storms are beautiful. That moment of absolute stillness before the sky breaks. Over the next few months, I meticulously built the paper trail. A good underwriter doesn't just find the flaw. He documents it so thoroughly that no lawyer on earth can contest it. I visited the bank every 2 weeks. I collected the transfer receipts, the IP logs, showing exactly which computer initiated the wire, and the official bank statements. I didn't interfere. I let Julian buy his custom golf clubs. I let him book a non-refundable, first-class vacation to St. Bart's for the upcoming spring. I let him build his house of cards as high as he possibly could, because the higher it gets, the less wind it takes to knock it down. Clara called me in mid-February, crying. She had found a statement from Apex Ventures in Julian's home office. She didn't understand what it was, but she recognized the bank's letterhead, and she saw the massive sums of money moving in and out of the account. "Dad," she sobbed into the phone, her voice cracking. "He told me he got a bonus, but the statement says something about a trust distribution. Did you give him money? Why is he hiding this from me?" I sat in my car for a while. The winter sun was setting, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the driveway. I hated hearing her cry. I hated that I had to let her endure this uncertainty. But if I told her the truth now, she would confront him. He would panic, move the remaining funds into offshore accounts, and claim it was a misunderstanding. The trap hadn't snapped completely shut yet. "Clara, listen to me," I said, my voice deliberately soft, projecting the quiet authority I used to calm panicked clients after a total loss. "I need you to put that paper exactly where you found it. Do not say a word to him. Not a single word. Can you do that for me?" "I'm scared, Dad," she whispered. I know, sweetheart," I replied, "but I have it under control. I promise you Leo's future is safe. Just wait." She trusted me. That is the difference between my daughter and her husband. Her trust was a genuine currency. His was a counterfeit bill. By the time March rolled around, the ice on the lake began to crack and splinter. Tax season had officially arrived, and Julian's high-end accounting firm in Chicago was about to receive a federally mandated 1099 form directly from my bank, detailing a $450,000 non-exempt, fully taxable distribution. But that was only the first jaw of the trap. The second jaw was the clawback clause I had secretly embedded in the trust's foundational charter, a clause that gave the primary trustee the unilateral right to demand immediate repayment of any unapproved funds to protect the fee. Principal. He had spent the money, he owed taxes on the money, and in exactly 3 weeks, he was going to owe the money back to me. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. I sat at my kitchen table, a fresh cup of espresso steaming in front of me, and picked up my phone. It was time to invite Julian over for one last Sunday dinner. That Sunday, the 14th of April, was one of those rare, blindingly bright days that occasionally break through the gray of a Minnesota spring. The snow had finally turned to slush along the edges of the driveway. I had called Clara early that morning and suggested she take little Leo down to the Great Lakes Aquarium for the afternoon. I told her I needed to discuss some dry administrative details regarding the house deed with Julian, and that the boy would only be bored out of his mind. She agreed, though I could hear the tight, anxious string in her voice. She knew something was shifting. She just didn't know the sheer scale of the avalanche that was about to come down. Julian arrived at my house at exactly 4 o'clock. He pulled his leased European SUV into my driveway, taking up 2 spaces, and stepped out wearing a lightweight cashmere sweater that had no business being worn in Duluth before May. The $15,000 rose gold watch was still firmly strapped to his wrist. He walked up my front steps whistling. He was a man who believed he had successfully navigated the rapids and was now drifting into open water. He pushed the front door open without knocking, a habit I had never corrected, but always noted. "Elias," he called out, his voice booming down the hallway. "I hope you've got the good coffee going. I only have about an hour. I've got a tea time at the indoor simulator with some of the senior partners." I was standing in the kitchen, carefully tamping the espresso grounds for the La Pavone. I didn't turn around. "In the living room, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Julian rounded the corner, still checking his phone, a confident smirk plastered across his face. He stopped dead in his tracks. The smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. Sitting in the leather wingback chair by the fireplace, nursing a cup of black coffee, was Marcus. Marcus was not wearing his weekend clothes. He was wearing his courtroom suit, a dark, heavy wool that made him look like a piece of industrial machinery. His leather briefcase was resting on the coffee table. "Julian," Marcus said. His gravelly baritone didn't carry a shred of warmth. It was a statement of fact. Julian's eyes darted between Marcus and me. His jaw immediately started doing that slow grinding thing. "Marcus," he replied, attempting a casual laugh that came out sounding like dry leaves being crushed. "I didn't realize we were having a dinner party. Elias didn't mention you'd be here. I asked Marcus to drop by," I said, walking into the living room and taking a seat on the sofa opposite him. I did not offer Julian a coffee. I did not offer him a seat. I just looked at him. "We have a few loose ends to tie up before tax day on Tuesday." Julian shoved his hands into his pockets. He was trying to project relaxed confidence, but his shoulders were rigid. "Listen, guys, if this is about the trust's asset reallocation, my accountants in Chicago are already handling the quarterly reports. You don't need to double up on the billable hours. Everything is optimized. Here's the thing about liars. When they feel cornered, they start using corporate buzzwords. They use words like optimized and reallocation to build a wall of jargon between themselves and the truth. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow." "Your accountants in Chicago," Marcus repeated, opening his briefcase with a heavy metallic click. "You mean the firm of Davis and Hughes, correct?" Julian blinked. "Yes. How do you—" "I spoke with Brian Hughes on Thursday afternoon," Marcus interrupted smoothly, pulling a thin manila folder from his briefcase and setting it squarely on the glass coffee table. "Brian is a very competent CPA. Thorough, law-abiding, completely terrified of federal audits. He called me because my name is listed as the secondary legal counsel on the irrevocable trust you've been withdrawing from." Julian's face lost a fraction of its color. "Withdrawing?" "I initiated a standard administrative transfer to an LLC. It's an insulated holding company. Elias authorized the amendment himself." Julian pointed a finger at me, his voice rising just a hair. "You signed the paper, Elias." I leaned back into the sofa. I crossed my legs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I did sign an amendment, Julian, but you didn't read the fine print of the bank's filing. The LLC you created is a single-member entity. Under the specific bylaws of my daughter's trust, any transfer to a single-member LLC controlled by a non-primary beneficiary is automatically categorized by the bank as an early non-exempt, fully taxable cash distribution. The silence sat like a fifth guest. It had absolute weight to it. Nobody said anything for a while. "What does that mean?" Julian asked. His voice had dropped an octave. The arrogance was completely stripped away, leaving only the hollow, echoing sound of panic. I gestured to the folder on the table. "Open it." Julian hesitated. His hand was shaking slightly as he reached down and flipped the cover open. Lying on top was a standard federal 1099-R tax form, issued by my bank, with a copy sent directly to the IRS. In the box labeled "Gross Distribution," the number was printed in stark black ink: $450,000. "You didn't move money into a holding company, Julian," Marcus said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You took a $450,000 personal paycheck. And because you are legally classified as a high-income earner, that distribution is subject to short-term capital gains, state income tax, and an early withdrawal penalty." Brian Hughes ran the numbers for us. "Your immediate tax liability, due by 11:59 p.m. this coming Tuesday, is exactly $166,500, payable to the Internal Revenue Service." Julian stared at the paper, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of his front door and realized his entire house was gone. "No," he whispered. "No, that's a mistake. The money is in the LLC. It's corporate capital." "The IRS doesn't care about your LLC," I said quietly. "They care about the Social Security number attached to it. Yours." Julian's eyes darted frantically around the room. The gears in his head were spinning out of control, sparking and grinding. "Fine," he snapped, his voice suddenly shrill. "Fine, it's a clerical error. I'll just wire the tax payment out of the LLC's account. The funds are there. I'll pay the damn taxes, and then I'll have the rest transferred back to the trust." He thought he had found the exit. He thought he could just buy his way out of the trap, using the money he had stolen. I tapped my right index finger twice against my thumb. "You can't," I told him. Julian stopped. He looked at me, his chest heaving slightly. "What do you mean I can't? The LLC has over $200,000 in liquid cash left. I can cover the taxes." I looked at Marcus. Marcus pulled a second piece of paper from his briefcase. It was a printout of a stock chart. It looked like a cliff face. "You bought into the Horizon Tech leveraged ETF," Marcus said, his voice flat, devoid of any sympathy. "You put $200,000 of trust money into a triple-leveraged fund 3 weeks ago, hoping to ride the tech bounce. But there was no bounce. The sector corrected violently on Wednesday following the new semiconductor export bans. That fund is down nearly 70%. Marcus slid the chart across the table. "Your $200,000 is currently worth $62,000. You don't have the money to pay the IRS, Julian." Julian physically staggered. He took a half-step backward and fell heavily onto the armrest of the sofa. His breathing became shallow, rapid gasps. The polished, glossy executive was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy, drowning in a suit he couldn't afford. "Oh my God," he choked out, clutching his chest. "Oh my God, I'm ruined. They'll garnish my wages. My firm, my partners will see the lien. They'll force me out." He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. The smugness from the previous weeks had evaporated into the cold Minnesota air. "Elias," he begged, his voice cracking completely. "Elias, please. You have to help me. You have to advance me the money from the trust to cover the tax bill. If I go down, Clara goes down. You said it yourself. I'm married to your daughter. You have to protect her." There it was, the final desperate play, using my own daughter as a human shield to save his own skin. I stood up. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the folder. I looked down at him. My face was a stone. "I am protecting her," I said, "from you." I pulled the final document from the back of the folder. "When I set up that irrevocable trust 12 years ago, I didn't just build a vault. I built an alarm system. Section 4, subsection C, the clawback clause." I dropped the paper onto his lap. "As the primary trustee, if I determine that a secondary administrator has made a withdrawal that fundamentally threatens the principal balance. I have the unilateral, unappealable right to demand immediate repayment in full. Julian stared blankly at the document on his lap. His brain was completely overloaded. He couldn't process the math anymore. You owe the IRS $166,000 by Tuesday, Marcus explained softly, driving the final nail into the coffin. And as of this morning, by official legal notice, served right here in this room, you owe the Clara Trust Fund exactly $450,000, payable by this Friday. If you fail to repay the trust, Elias will immediately file a civil suit for grand larceny and breach of fiduciary duty. We have the IP logs, we have the bank wires, we have your signature. Julian looked at his hands. They were trembling violently. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed him entirely. A house of cards in a wind tunnel. Done, Marcus asked me, closing his briefcase. Done, I replied. The following week moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of a controlled demolition. When you spend 4 decades in risk assessment, you learn that once a structural failure is mathematically guaranteed, you do not need to push the building. You just have to sit back and watch gravity do the work. Tuesday, the 15th of April, arrived in Duluth with a pale, washed-out sky. It came and went without a miracle. The $166,500 tax debt did not magically evaporate, because Julian used corporate buzzwords. By Wednesday afternoon, the reality of the federal deadline had firmly set into the concrete of his life. My phone rang at exactly 4:14 p.m. on Thursday. It was Julian. The voice on the other end of the line possessed absolutely none of the glossy catalog-ready arrogance that had walked into my house just a few days prior. It was thin, ragged, and punctuated by the heavy, stuttering breaths of a man experiencing a total freefall. He told me he had broken the lease on his European SUV, accepting a massive penalty just to walk away. He had liquidated what was left of his heavily damaged stock portfolio. He had even pawned the $15,000 rose gold chronograph he loved so much. All told, he had scraped together roughly $112,000. He begged me to accept it as a down payment. He pleaded with me not to file the civil suit for grand larceny. He promised he would sign any postnuptial agreement, any legally binding contract, as long as I didn't alert his architectural firm's senior partners to his insolvency. I listened to him without interrupting. I let the silence sit on the line while he exhausted himself. I have sat across from hundreds of clients who had just lost everything to a fire or a flood, and I know exactly what a man sounds like when he finally registers the sheer scale of his own ruin. Think about that for a second. The same man who treated me like a senile relic, incapable of understanding modern finance, was now sobbing through the speaker of my phone, begging for a lifeline. When he finally stopped talking, I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of an actuary reading a final ledger. Julian, I said smoothly, that $112,000 needs to be wired directly to the IRS by tomorrow morning to partially offset your penalties. If you give it to me, you will face federal tax evasion charges before my civil suit even reaches the docket. As for the Clara Trust Fund, I have officially executed the clawback provision regarding the primary residence in Fountain City. That house belongs to the trust. I filed the paperwork at the county clerk's office this morning to terminate your residency. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my daughter's property. I have a locksmith scheduled for 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. There was a long, suffocating pause on his end. Does Clara know? He choked out. She will know everything from me, I replied, and I will not be taking further questions from you. I ended the call. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel a triumphant rush of adrenaline. I just felt a cold, sterile relief, the kind you experience when you finally isolate a hazardous variable and remove it from the equation. That evening, I drove my neat-needy Ford F-150 over to Clara's house. The engine hummed with a reliable mechanical honesty. Gas, air, spark. It made sense to me. I brought the heavy manila folder containing Marcus's audited paper trail. When I walked through the front door, Julian was predictably not there. He was likely sitting in a cheap motel room on the edge of town, trying to calculate how his brilliant, optimized life had collapsed into ash. Clara was sitting on the living room sofa. Little Leo was asleep against her chest, his small hands clutching a plastic dinosaur. I sat down on the coffee table directly across from her. I didn't immediately reach out to hug her. I needed her to see me as a pillar of absolute stability, so she would understand that her world was not ending, even if her marriage was. I walked her through the documents slowly. I explained it using the simplest terms, stripping away the financial jargon. I showed her the midnight wire transfers from Julian's computer. I showed her the margin calls from his disastrous tech investments. And finally, I showed her the secondary trustee amendment he had manipulated her into signing under the guise of routine tax paperwork. Clara didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She just sat there, her hand resting protectively on Leo's back, while silent tears spilled over her eyelashes and dropped onto the collar of her shirt. The silence in the room had a terrible weight to it. It was the weight of a woman mourning not just a husband, but an illusion. She realized that the man she slept next to didn't view her as a partner. He viewed her as a vulnerability, a blank check to fund his arrogance. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. I should have seen it, I thought. I thought he was just ambitious. I thought he was trying to build something for us. I reached out and placed my hand over hers. My knuckles were scarred and stiff with age, but my grip was steady. "You have nothing to apologize for, Clara," I told her softly. "Your kindness is not a defect. It's a virtue. His greed is what destroyed him. I am still here on this earth to make absolutely sure that no one, no matter how clever they think they are, can dismantle the safety your mother and I built for you and this boy. It is handled. The money is safe." The divorce proceedings moved swiftly over the next 3 months. They were quiet, surgical, and ruthlessly managed by Marcus. Julian offered zero resistance. He had no legal standing, no capital, and no fight left in him. Once the IRS placed a federal lien on his remaining assets and began garnishing his wages, his architectural firm invoked a morality and insolvency clause in his partnership agreement. They forced him to resign immediately, buying out his negligible shares for pennies on the dollar to distance themselves from the liability. His reputation in the Minneapolis corporate sphere was completely atomized. With no income and a mountain of federal debt, he moved back into his childhood bedroom in his parents' house in a small, quiet town in southern Minnesota. He had once told me that financial risk was something you manipulate. In the end, the risk he failed to calculate was the quiet old man he thought he had outsmarted. It is now late June. The punishing cold of the Duluth winter has finally surrendered to the brief, vibrant warmth of summer. The breeze coming off Lake Superior smells of pine needles and fresh water blowing gently through my open kitchen window. Clara's house is entirely purged of Julian's presence. Marcus and I restructured the remaining funds in the irrevocable trust, locking the principal behind an impenetrable legal fortress that cannot be touched by anyone, not even Clara. Until Leo turns 25, Clara has returned to teaching art. Last weekend, I stood on the shore and watched her laugh, a real genuine laugh, while helping Leo fly a bright red kite against the blue sky. Some days, when I am sitting alone in the quiet of my living room, I wonder if I did the right thing by letting the traps stay open as long as I did. I wonder if I should have just stopped him the moment he asked for the password. Most days, I know I did exactly what was necessary. That's enough. I don't regret what I did. I regret that I had to do it. The true satisfaction of a father doesn't come from the chaos of revenge or from seeing another man broken. It comes from control. It comes from knowing you secured the perimeter, that the storm hit the walls you built and broke itself to pieces while your family slept safely inside. I turned back to my kitchen counter. The 1998 La Pavoni Europa Cola is heated and ready, the brass boiler gleaming in the morning sun. I place a heavy ceramic cup under the spout. I grip the manual lever. I pull it down, using the steady, measured weight of my arm, feeling the exact resistance of the water meeting the coffee grounds. I listen to the slow, rich extraction, the deep aroma of espresso filling the quiet house. I tap my right index finger twice against my thumb. The ledger is balanced. Got him, Mom, I say to the quiet room.